Welcome back. We're getting ready to do the third segment, and we're going to talk about judgments and attributions. And I think it's just basic human nature to judge, size up situations, judge other people, judge the actions of followers, judge the actions of your superiors. You're always judging something somewhere along the way, and they give you when we talk about attributions, they give you a definition in the text. It's I think a fairly decent definition. It says a judgment regarding a person's motives or personality as a perceived explanation for the cause of that person's behavior or performance. And I'm sure that we've all been in those situations that you're trying to figure out what's impacting a person's performance. And so I guess in my experience, you sit down, you put the goals together, usually in October. You start the goal planning process in October. You're working on it in November and December because you want the goals in place by December the 31st, ready to hit the ground running for the new fiscal year. And so you've got these goals established. You roll them out to everybody, and everybody's complaining. They think the goals are too aggressive. So in most of the companies, at least in most of the healthcare companies I worked in, that's where I spent most of my time. You have goals that's kind of a three-tiered goal. You have a goal that it's a goal that signifies it meets. You've got a goal that succeeds, and you've got a goal that's a stretch goal. So maybe it's maybe in healthcare, then I'll just use sales as an example. Maybe the meets goal that keeps you employed is you've got to increase sales 10%. And maybe the exceeds goal is 15, and maybe the stretch goal is 20. And so you've got 10, 15, 20 as the goals that are established. And again, they are definitive, they're measurable. It's, you either hit 10% or you don't hit 10%, or you hit 15% or you don't hit 15% or 20%. So you establish those goals, and so you're rolling along, and maybe depending on how often you do evaluations, I've always liked to do them on a monthly basis, at least a monthly basis. And so at the end of the first month, you've got your goals, and you can forecast. As an economist, you're always forecasting or estimating where the goals are going to be. And so you're always wondering about, you've got some individuals that are just knocking the goal out of the park, and you've got other individuals that you're concerned aren't going to make their goal. And not only is it going to negatively impact them, it could negatively impact your team and negatively impact your organization. And so that's where you're talking about attributions. And the attribution can be external. It can be they've got something going on in their personal life. They've got some family issues. It could be external because of policies and procedures. They're not in place to efficiently improve the process or to ensure that you're going to hit your goals or your standards that you set forth for your team. And it can also be internal and negative in nature. And when it's internal, you start to look at, what are the motives, what are the nature, what's the personality of the individual? Is there something internally going on? Is it they can't work with their other team members? And so when they need help, the other team members won't provide assistance for them, or they don't work well with, again, go back to the medical informatics or medical economics teams I've managed and led over the years. And maybe they have a negative relationship or an adversarial relationship with the IT department, or an adversarial relationship for individuals that are completing surveys, or I don't know. There's a lot of internal strife that can impact these attributions. But the fundamental, and they talk about the fundamental attribution error in the text, is we overestimate the effect of internal factors and underestimate the effect of external factors. And I think that's a very valid point. Most people, because they are concerned with the organization where they work, are concerned with internal factors. And we sometimes forget about the external relationships, what kind of that we don't have a sense of where the individual is coming from, or what their family life is like, or what they're are they socially inept to some point. And there's a quote in the text, and I've read a couple of articles that have written about Father Boyle, and he was in Southern California, and he has Homeboy Industries, and it's for individuals been incarcerated. And he comes out, then they come out and they go to work for Father Boyle, and they produce food items. They've got bake shops, they've got different things. They sell food baskets, and Father Boyle, the quote in there, it says to stand in awe, not judgment. And he tries to understand the situation and the context with which people are functioning in. And I think that is where they're trying to get to in the text, is so many of these external factors, we don't know what goes on in somebody's personal life. So that's where I think that's where we end up with the fundamental attribution error. As a feedback giver, negative attributes can seem cathartic for leaders. You end up with knee-jerk reactions. People don't like to be judged. I mean, I don't like to be judged, and most other people, I think it's human nature, you don't like to be judged. And so it makes the feedback receiver defensive and results in a lack of behavior change. So when you're going through the attributes, and especially if they're negative attributes, it just ends up with a antagonistic or a defensive situation. Kevin Johnson, and there's a couple of quotes in the books. One's Kevin Johnson, one's General James Mathis, that they talk about. Kevin Johnson says, stick to your principles, but abandon your assumptions. Seems pretty straightforward to me. Mathis says, don't apologize for your values, but don't assume that they're always right. And I think that is a very good comment. Don't always assume you're right. Everybody has a certain strategy, a certain vision, a certain set of values, but just because they seem right to you doesn't necessarily mean that that they are right, or they would seem right to everybody else. But negative feedback, sometimes it is warranted, and it depends on how you approach it as to how much antagonism you develop with negative feedback. Because sometimes you need some type of negative feedback to achieve organizational goals and to develop your followers. Sometimes you just have to sometimes punch them along. It's almost like I've heard that people talking about leading a team. It's like sometimes they feel like they're herding cats. It's just trying to keep everybody heading in the right direction, and some of them you got to punch along and keep them moving, or they fall behind. You have to report the negative behavior, explain how it hurts your organization, how it hurts the team, how you might be able to work together to reach a solution. I've tried that in the past, and it works reasonably well. If you sit down with somebody, and I had an individual that just could not get to work on time, and as an exempt employee, the individual wasn't punching a time clock, but everybody else working 8 to 5, and he was coming in like 8:30, 8:45, and maybe leaving at 5:15. So he was skating a good 30 minutes to an hour every day, and finally set the individual down and said, look, you're negatively impacting the team. It's hurting the organization. We're not as productive as we should be, and let's figure out how we can work together to get you more in tune with the work hours. And after some back and forth, and it got a little contested, a little heated, but at the end of the day, he finally understood that his inability to get to work on time was negatively affecting everything we were trying to do. And he did turn his behavior around. He started coming in at 8 o'clock and actually started working. He still started working to 5:15 because he was again, I didn't understand the external piece of it because he was carpooling. And the person he rode with didn't have to be to work until 9. And so they'd ride into downtown Buffalo, park where the other person worked, and he'd walk over to work. So I don't know. It just understanding that external piece helped the two of us to come together and work together for a situation. And we finally set it up that his work hours should be 9 to 6. And that satisfied him. I explained it to their team members. They didn't understand the external piece of it. Everybody was happy, and productivity started to increase again. When we're talking about evaluations, and again, it goes back to the HR director that I had at HealthNet, always start out, it's what's worked for me, always start out positive and then address possibilities for improvement. And I think that has served me well. You know, I don't know whether you tried something like that. But if you're having trouble with negative feedback, maybe it's just an alternative approach. And then the one piece that I think falls out of the evaluation process, and I've had it fall out on, not only me receiving feedback, but me giving feedback, and I'm as guilty as a lot of leaders are, is the one-on-one coaching. It's the primary source of feedback. It's for most cases, it's between the leader and the follower. You can have some one-on-one coaching. It's kind of an odd misnomer, but you can have some coaching where it's the leader and the team, and you can, mix together in a kind of a fluid manner if you need to. So it's the one-on-one coaching. So in general, it's, targeted toward performance improvement. And I've always found that when I had the large team meeting, I always had one once a month to make sure that everybody understood where we were on goals, where we were falling behind on goals as a team, what it looked like. And then I would have bi-weekly meetings or sometimes weekly meetings with individuals within the team and talk about what I saw that maybe working together, we could help them improve their opportunity or their probability of hitting their goals. So it's kind of a fluid manner. You can kind of work them together. The key steps in coaching, and they go through this and do a pretty good job in the text on this. And again, I've always tried to have goals, or maybe it's just been the way HR set it up, where you had 3 goals. You had meets, you had exceeds, and you had stretch goals. But you develop the goals. We always tried to have the goals develop and rolled out to everybody down toward the tail end of December, so everybody knew, so they could hit the ground running when it comes to the start of the new fiscal year. So it says, develop the goals, communicate to followers. All parties must understand the goal of effective performance. And again, definitive, binary, black and white, measurable, whatever terminology you want to use, have the goals in such a way that they are structured in that you either hit them or you don't hit them. And that makes it, or at least I've found, that makes it a lot easier to lead and manage a team and to ensure that everybody is successful as they work throughout the year. And then the second step is collect good data. Don't rely on hearsay. I've always been fortunate that I've had individuals working for me that can generate monthly reports. They scrub the data, they ensure it's relevant and accurate, and they generate the monthly reports. The monthly reports are disseminated to everybody. And we always know as a team where we stand on our, and not only where we stand on our monthly and quarterly goals, but where we stand on our annual goal, because we are constantly forecasting out ahead to make sure that we're going to hit that annual goal. And then we we talk about, or at least the text talks about, you want to analyze the data and identify the gaps. And they identify the gaps, it's between the goal and the data that's being generated. And a lot of times it's the gaps that people have the most trouble with, because let's say that you are, and we'll go back to the sales goal. Let's say your meets goals, you had increased sales 10%. That's your annual goal. Where the gaps are, and trying to get the gaps communicated, the potential gaps communicated to the receiver of the feedback, whether it's at the team level or whether it's at the individual level, individual follower level. It's how do you take the goal, how do you take where you stand actually in, say, the end of February, and how do you take and forecast and estimate that, based on where we are in February and how we see things progressing over the remaining 10 months, where we're going to be when it hits at the end of the year. So it's sometimes the receiver of the feedback has a lot of difficulty understanding the estimation process or the projection process or the forecasting process. So as a leader, sometimes that does present some difficulty. It says provide feedback, advice, and encouragement. And that's where it goes back to the be here and now. Minimum distractions, full attention. They talk about, in the text, they talk about timely, specific, behavioral, balanced. And when they talk about timely, if you start to see, especially a behavioral issue, just like the individual that wasn't coming into work, as soon as the negative performance is identified, as soon as you see it start to impact the team, that's when you start having these coaching one-on-one sessions. It needs to be specific and behavioral in nature, balanced by including positive feedback. And as negative as the situation has been in the past for me, I've always been able to find something positive to lead with. Some individuals or some teams, it's more difficult than others, but I've always been able to find some kind of a positive nugget to kind of jumpstart the conversation, try to kick everything off. It needs to be owned by coaching, by the coach believing in the feedback. And that's where they talk about don't ever get into hearsay. Listen and make sure that feedback is understood. Again, when you're talking about especially negative feedback or attribution or whatever terminology you want to use, that's where it gets into. You want to be able to read expressions, facial expressions, look at body language, make sure everybody understands and on the same page. They talk about making sure the evaluation is signed and agreed to. And then, and as important as anything else, is develop the coaching and mentoring steps. Develop, some kind of a timeline that you can set aside that says, we need to have monthly meetings, just the two of us, one-on-one, or we may need to have bi-weekly meetings one-on-one to ensure that you have the opportunity to improve and make sure you have the opportunity to hit your financial or your annual goals. And also detail the steps taken. Different goals have different steps that you're going to take as a coaching process. So make sure those steps are detailed, and make sure that not only you as the giver, but the individual as receiver understands the fundamental issue, understands what it's going to take to improve that fundamental issue, what steps are going to be taken, and what that timeline needs to look like. You don't want any misunderstanding. You want everything to be black and white. You want it to, from my perspective, I've always wanted a signed document. And I've always had individuals sign the document, not so much that they agree with my evaluation, but that I've presented the information. It's an indication of that I've presented the information. They understand where I'm coming from, and they understand the steps we're going to go through to ensure that they develop their full potential. And lastly, I'm going to jump in here and talk about this 360-degree feedback. It's a feedback mechanism that I've seen multiple stops along the way. Works well in some companies it doesn't work well in. It's conceived, conceived or perceived, however you want to phrase it, as leader development. It's a variety of hierarchical and lateral sources, and its upward feedback is most common. So when they talk about the upward feedback, it's feedback while you're taking some feedback from your supervisor. And they've got the little graph in the text there that's got the target leader in the middle. Up the top, it's got the supervisor. Bottom, it's got subordinates, got peers on one side and customers on the other side. So that's where they're talking about the hierarchical, can't even say it this morning, hierarchical and the lateral type of feedback. So what typically happens, or at least what's typically happened in the companies that I've worked for, is either HR reaches out to you or your supervisor reaches out to you and says, hey, I need a dozen people, peers, subordinates, customers, that might be able to give you some feedback, and you'll, give them a list of a dozen people. And, I've seen it work that way. I've seen it work the opposite, where the supervisor or the HR team just randomly picks a dozen people that they're going to survey, and they'll have a bunch of leadership questions, and they're going to, receive feedback from them. They send out the surveys. They are anonymous because they want honest feedback. And that, to me, has always been a concern in some companies, that you're not getting honest feedback. I'd rather have honest feedback, even if it's negative, because I want the opportunity to change my approach to being a leader. But, some companies I've seen where they, especially when HR randomly selects them, you just get, or when I've had individuals that reported to me, I asked them to send me a list of people that they wanted to be evaluated by, and they send me like all their buddies and stuff. When you develop this list, if you want honest feedback, you've got to have some give and take, and you've got to have a pretty diverse group among peers and subordinates and customers along the way. And again, the downside to this is the accuracy of the information coming from the feedback survey, but more importantly, it's the coaching and the follow-up. So you go through, and it's this 360 feedback, especially if you're selected to be one of the surveyors or to be surveyed, it takes some time. And so you go through this process, they collect all the data, you sit down with your supervisor goes through it, and then 9 times out of 10, the supervisor doesn't do anything about it. Don't develop, there's no coaching process developed. You can push them and they'll, set up some meetings, but you as a leader, you need to be proactive about it. And if you go through the exercise of a 360-degree feedback, or the exercise of any evaluation, you need to make sure that you develop those coaching steps, and you need to follow through, because you're trying to maximize the human capital of all of your followers. That's the way you improve as a team. It's the way you become more efficient as a team. It's the way you become more efficient and profitable as an organization, is by maximizing human capital. And as a leader, that's one of your jobs, is to maximize that human capital of all of your followers. It's not just one or two. It's the total team that reports up to you, is to maximize that human capital. And the evaluation process, the mentoring and the coaching and the follow-through, those are some aspects that are key to maximizing the human capital of your team. That's all I've got on Chapter 7. We're going to come back on Chapter 8, and I can't remember. Team and shared leadership on Chapter 8. So, and there are actually some, and I haven't uploaded yet, but there's going to be some good nuggets come out of Chapter 8 too. So hope you've enjoyed kind of walking through on Chapter 7. And again, next time you see me, we'll hit the ground running on Chapter 8. Talk to you soon.